I'm Austin Lugo, and this is The Vignette. As you can probably tell, my voice is significantly better than it was last week. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily at 100%, but with a series of cold medicines and different techniques of sorts, my voice is coming back, which is nice when most of my job is these kind of podcasts and talking. So I'm here, I'm back, and today we are going to be reading The Man Who Shot Snapping Turtles. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm very excited to read this one. I've read this one many times, but here it is. The Man Who Shot Snapping Turtles by Edmund Wilson. In the days when I lived in Haycock County, I had an uncomfortable neighbor, a man named Asa M. Stryker. Yet at one time, he told me, taught chemistry in some sorry-sounding college in Pennsylvania. But now he lived on a little money, which he had been lucky enough to inherit. I had the feeling about him that somewhere in the background was defeat or frustration or disgrace. He was a bachelor and kept house with 2 servants, a cook and a man around the place. I never knew anyone to visit him, though he would occasionally go away for short periods, when he told me he was visiting his relatives. Mr. Stryker had a small pond in his place, and from the very first time I met him, his chief topic of conversation was the wild ducks that used to come to this pond. In his insensitive-sounding way, he admired them, minutely observing their markings, and he cherished and protected them like pets. Several pairs, in fact, which he fed all the year round, settled permanently on the pond. He would call my attention in his hard accent to the richness of their chestnut browns, the ruddiness of their backs or breasts, their sharp contrasts of light with dark, and their white neck rings and purple wing bars, like the decorative liveries and insignia of some exalted order. The cuprous greens and blues that gave them the look of being expensively dressed. Mr. Stryker was particularly struck by the idea that there was something princely about them, something which, as he used to say, Frick or Charlie Schwab couldn't buy. And he would point out to me their majesty as they swam, cocking their heads with such dignity and nonchalantly wagging their tails. He was much troubled by the depredations of snapping turtles, which made terrible ravages of the ducklings. He would sit on his porch, he said, and see the little ducklings disappear, as the turtles grabbed their feet and dragged them under, and feel sore at his helplessness to prevent it. As he lost brood after brood in this way, the subject came, in fact, to obsess him. He had apparently hoped that his pond might be made a sort of paradise for ducks, in which they could breed without danger. He never shot them, even in season, and did not approve of their being shot at all. But sometimes not one survived the age when it was little enough to fall victim to the turtles. These turtles he fought in a curious fashion. He would stand on the bank with a rifle and pot them, and they stuck up their heads, sometimes hitting a duck by mistake. Only the ducks that were thus killed accidentally did he think it right to eat. One night, when he invited me to dine with him on one of them, I asked him why he did not protect the ducklings by shutting them up in a wire pen and providing them with a small pool to swim in. He told me they had already decided to try this, and the next time I saw him, he reported that the ducklings were doing finely. Yet the pen, as it turned out later, did not permanently solve the problem, for the wild ducks, when they got old enough, flew out of it, and they were still young enough to be caught by the turtles. Mr. Stryker could not, as he said, keep them captive all their lives. The thing was rather, he finally concluded, to try to get rid of the turtles, against which he was coming, I noted, to display a slightly morbid animosity, and after a good deal of serious thought, he fixed upon a heroic method. He had just come into a new inheritance, which, he told me, made him pretty well off, and he decided to strain the pond. The operation took the whole of one summer. It horribly disfigured his place, and it afflicted the neighborhood with the stench of the slime that was now laid bare. One family, whose place adjoined Stryker's, were obliged to go away for weeks during the heaviest days of August, when the draining had become complete. Stryker, however, stayed and personally attended to the turtles, cutting off their heads himself, and he had men posted day and night at the places where they went to lay their eggs. At last, someone complained to the Board of Health, and they made him fill up his pond. He was indignant with the town authorities and declared that he had not yet got all the turtles, some of which were still hiding in the mud, and he and his crew put in a mad last day combing the bottom with giant rakes. The next spring, the turtles reappeared, though at first there were only a few. Stryker came over to see me and told me a harrowing story. He described how he had been sitting on his porch watching my finest pair of mallards, out with their new brood of young ones. They were still just little fluffy balls, but they sailed along with that air they have of knowing that there's something special. From the moment that they can catch a water bug for themselves, they know that they're the lords of the pond. And I was just thinking how damn glad I was that no goblins were going to get them anymore. Well, the phone rang and I went to answer it. And when I came out again, I distinctly had the impression that there were fewer ducks in the pond. So I counted them, and sure enough, there was one duckling shy. The next day, another had vanished, and he had hired a man to watch the pond. Several snapping turtles were seen, but he had not succeeded in catching them. By the middle of the summer, the casualties seemed almost as bad as before. This time, Mr. Stryker decided to do a better job. He came to see me again and startled me by holding forth in vain that recalled the pulpit. If God has created the mallard, he said, a thing of beauty and grace, how can he allow these dirty, filthy mud turtles to prey upon his handiwork and destroy it? He created the mud turtles first, I said. The reptiles came before the birds, and they survived with the strength God gave them. There is no instance on record of God's intervention in the affairs of any animal species lower in the scale than man. But if evil triumphs there, said Stryker, it may triumph everywhere, and we must fight it with every weapon in our power. That's the Manchesian hearsay, I replied. It's an error to assume that the devil is contending on equal terms with God and that the fate of the world is in doubt. I'm not sure of that sometimes, said Stryker. I noticed that his bright little eyes seemed to dim in a curious way, as if he were drawing into himself to commune with some private fear. How do we know that God isn't getting old? How do we know that some of his lower creatures aren't beginning to get out of hand and clean up the higher ones? He decided to poison the turtles, and he brushed up, as he told me, on his chemistry. The result, however, was all too devastating. The chemicals he put into the water wiped out not only the turtles, but also all the other animals and most of the vegetation in the pond. When the chemical analysis that the water was no longer tainted, he put back the ducks again, but they found so little to eat that they presently flew away and ceased to frequent the place. In the meantime, some new ones that had come there had died from the poisoned water. One day, as Asa M. Stryker was walking around his estate, he encountered a female snapping turtle unashamedly clawing in the direction of the pond. She had obviously just been laying her eggs. He had the whole of his place closed in with a fence of thick meshed wire which went down a foot into the ground. I had asked him why he didn't have the pond rather than the estate thus enclosed, and he had explained that this would have made it impossible for him to look at the ducks from the porch. But turtles must have gotten through the gate when it was open, or they must have been in hiding all the time. Stryker was, as the English say, livid, and people became a little afraid of him because they thought he was getting cracked. 2. That afternoon, he paid a visit to a man named Clarence Latouche, whose place was just behind Stryker's. Latouche was a native of New Orleans, and he worked in the advertising business. When Asa Stryker arrived, he was consuming a tall Scotch highball, unquestionably not his first, and he tried to make Stryker have a drink in the hope it would relieve his tension. But I don't use it, thanks, said Stryker, and he started his theological line about the ducks and the snapping turtles. Clarence Latouche, while Stryker was talking, dropped his eyes for a moment to the wing collar and the large satin cravat which his neighbor always wore in the country, and which were evidently associated in his mind with some idea, acquired in a provincial past, of the way for a man of means to dress. It seemed to him almost indecent that this desperate moral anxiety should agitate a being like Stryker. Well, he commented in his easy way when he had listened for a few minutes, if the good God can't run the universe where he's supposed to be the supreme authority so as to eliminate the force of evil, I don't see how we poor humans in our weakness can expect to do any better with a few acres of Pea Cake County, where we're at the mercy of all the rest of creation. It ought to be possible, said Stryker, and I say it damn well shall be possible. As I see it, said Clarence Latouche, again and again unsuccessfully offering Stryker a drink, we're faced with a double problem. On the one hand, you've got to get rid of the snappers. And, on the other hand, you've got to keep the ducks. So far, you haven't been able to do either. Whatever measures you take, you lose the ducks and you can't kill the snappers. Now, it seems to me, if you'll pardon my saying so, that you've overlooked the real solution. The only and, if you don't mind me saying so, the obvious way to deal with the matter. I've been over the whole grounds, said Stryker, growing more tense and turning slightly hostile under pressure of his pent-up passion. And I doubt whether there's any method that I haven't considered with the utmost care. It seems to me, said Clarence Latouche in his gentle Louisiana voice, that going about the thing as you have been, you've arrived at a virtual impasse, and that you ought to approach the problem from a totally different angle. If you do that, you'll find it perfectly simple. Stryker seemed about to protest fiercely, but Clarence continued in a vein of mellow alcoholic explaining. The trouble is, as I see it, that up to now you've been going on the assumption that you ought to preserve the birds at the expense of getting rid of the turtles. Why not go on the opposite assumption? They ought to work at cultivating the snappers, shoot the ducks when they come around, and eat them. That is, when the law permits. Mr. Stryker raised a clenched fist and started up in articulate anger. Or if you don't want to do that, shoot them off. Then feed up the snappers on raw meat. Snappers are right good eating, too. We make soup out of them down in my part of the country. Mr. Stryker stood speechless for such a long moment that Clarence was afraid, he said afterwards, that his neighbor would fall down in a fit. And he got up and patted him on the shoulder and exerted all his tact and charm. All I can say, said Stryker, as he was going out the door, is that I can't understand your attitude. Right is right and wrong is wrong, and you have to choose between them. I've never been much of a moralist, said Clarence, and I dare say my whole point of view is a low and pragmatical one. 3. Stryker spent a troubled and restless night, so he afterwards told Clarence Latouche, but he got up very early, as he always did, to go hunting for breakfasting turtles, which he baited with pieces of steak. He now scooped them up with a net, and he paused for a moment over the first one he caught before he cut off its head. He scrutinized it with a new curiosity, and its appearance enraged him afresh. He detested its blunt, sullen visage, its thick legs with their outspread claws, and its thick and thorny toothed tail that it could not even pull into its shell as other turtles could. It was not even a genuine turtle. Chelydra serpentia, they called it, because it resembled a snake, and crawled around like a lizard. He bait it with a stick, and it snapped with a sharp popping sound, and as he held the beast up in his net, in the limpid morning air which was brimming the day like a tide, it looked, with its feet dipping slime, its dull shell that resembled a sunken log, as fetid, as cold, and as dark as the bottom of the pond itself. He was almost surprised at the gush of blood when he sawed away the head. What good purpose, he asked himself in horror, could such a creature serve? Subterranean, ugly, and brutal, with only one idea in its head, or rather one instinct in its nature, to seize and hold down its prey. The turtle had snapped at the hoop of the net, and even now that its head was severed, its jaws were still holding on. Stryker pried the head off the net and tossed it into the water. Another turtle rose to snatch it. Then why not even the tables on nature? Why not prey on what preyed on us? Why not exploit the hideous mud turtle, as his friend from the south had suggested? Why not devour him daily in the form of turtle soup? And if one could not eat soup every day, why not turn him into an object of commerce? Why not make the public eat him? Let the turtles create economic instead of killing aesthetic value. He snickered at what seemed to him a fantasy. But he returned to Clarence Latouche's that day in one of his expansive moods that rather gave Clarence the creeps. Nothing easier, cried Latouche, much amused. His advertising copy irked him, and he enjoyed an opportunity to burlesque it. You know, the truth is that a great big proportion of the canned turtle soup that's sold is made of snapping turtles. But that isn't the way they advertise it. If you advertise it frankly as snapper, it will look like something brand new, and all you'll need is the snob appeal to put it over on the can opening public. There's a man canning rattlesnakes in Florida, and it ought to be a lot easier to sell snappers. All you've got to do up here in the north is to persuade people to buy a product, is to convince them that there's some kind of social prestige attached to it. And all you'd have to do with your snappers would be to give the customers the idea that a good old white-haired darky with a beaming smile used to serve sorrel soup to old massa. All you need is a little smart advertising, and you can have as many people eating snappers as are eating, he named a popular canned salmon, which isn't even nutritious like snapper is. They make it out of the sweepings from a tire factory. I tell you what I'll do, he said, carried away by eloquence and whiskey. You organize a turtle farm, and I'll write you some copy free. You can pay me when and if you make money. Asim Stryker went away, scooped out 2 of the largest snappers, and that evening tried some snapping turtle soup, which seemed to him surprisingly savory. Then he looked at the breeding of turtles, about which, in the course of his war with them, he had already come to know a good deal. He replenished his depleted pond with turtles brought from other ponds, for which he paid the country boys a dime apiece, And at the end of a couple of years, he had such a population of snappers they had to stock the pond with more frogs. He was afraid they wouldn't snap at raw meat because it didn't move. Clarence Latouche helped him launch his campaign and, as he had promised, wrote the copy for it. At that time, there had already appeared an advertising a new angle on animal food, of which Clarence had been one of the originators. This was the device of representing the animals as gratified and even gleeful at the idea of being eaten. You saw pictures of manicured and berry-bond porkers capering and smirking at the prospect of being put up in glass jars as sausages, and of steers in white aprons and chef's hats that offered you their own sizzling beefsteaks. Clarence Latouche converted the snapping turtle into a genial and lovable creature, which became a familiar character to the readers of magazines and passengers on subway trains. He was pictured as always smiling, with a twinkle in his wise old eye, and he had always had some pungent saying which smacked of the southern backwoods, and which Clarence had great fun writing. As for the plantation angle, that was handled in a novel fashion. By this time, the public had been so oversold on old Massa with the white mustaches, so Clarence Latouche invented a listless southern lady, rather like Mrs. St. Clair in Uncle Tom's Cabin, who had to be revived by turtle soup. Social historians tell us, one of the advertisements ran, that more than 70% of the women of the Old South suffered from anemia and phthisis. Here there was an asterisk referring to a note which said tuberculosis. Turtle soup saved the sweethearts and mothers of a proud and gallant race. The rich juices of the Alabama snapping turtle, fed on a special diet handed down from the time of Jefferson and raised on immaculate turtle farms famous for a century in the deep South, supply the vital calories that are lacking in the modern meal. The feminine public were thus led to identify themselves with the lady in the advertisement, who was distinguished by a slim and supercilious smile, and to feel that they could enjoy a rich soup and yet remain slender and snooty. The advertisement went on to explain that a great many women still suffered, without knowing it, from anemia and TB, and that a regular consumption of turtle soup could cure or ward off these diseases. Deep South snapper soup became an immense success, and they presently stimulated the demand by putting on the market three kinds: Deep South snapper consommé, Deep South snapper tureen, extra thick, and Deep South snapper medium thick, with Alabama whole flour noodles. Stryker had to employ more helpers, and eventually built a small cannery out of sight of the house on his place. The turtles were raised in shallow tanks where they were easier to catch and control. 4. Mr. Stryker, who had not worked for years at anything but a struggle with the turtles, turned out to be strikingly able as a businessman and industrial organizer. He kept down his working crew, handled his correspondence himself, browbeat a small corps of salesmen, and managed to make a very large profit. He went himself to the city relief bureaus and unerringly picked out men who were capable and willing to work, but not too independent or intelligent, and he put over them his gardener as foreman. He would begin by lending these employees money, and he boarded and fed them on the place, so that they found themselves perpetually in debt to him. For secretary, he found a former schoolteacher who had lost her job in the local school. A plain woman of middle age, she had suddenly had a baby by an irresponsible Italian who worked in a crossroads garage. Oscar Stryker boarded the mother and agreed to pay board for the baby at a place he selected himself. As his business began to prosper, the secretary came to handle an immense amount of correspondence and other matters. But Stryker always criticized her severely and never let her feel she was important. He had managed to accomplish all this without ever giving people the impression that he was particularly interested in the business. He had always followed everything done with a keen and remorseless attention that masked itself under an appearance of impassivity. Every break for a market was seized at once. Every laxity of his working staff was pounced upon, and his attitude towards the turtles themselves had now changed in a fundamental fashion. He had come to admire their alertness and toughness, and when he would take them on a tour of his tanks, he would prod them and make them grip his stick, and then laugh proudly at their refusal to let go when he would bang them against the concrete. Clarence Latouche himself, who had invented snapper tureen, presently began to believe that he was a victim of Stryker's sharp dealing. At the time that the business had begun to make money, they had signed an agreement which provided that Clarence should get 10%, and he now felt that he ought to have a bigger share, all the more since his casual habits were proving fatal to his job at the agency. He had been kept on for the brilliant ideas which had sometimes been able to contribute, but he had lately been drinking more heavily, and it had been hinted that he might be fired. He was the kind of New Orleans man who, extraordinarily charming in youth, becomes rather overripe in his 20s and goes to pieces with astonishing rapidity. In New Orleans, this would not have been noticed. But in the north, he had never been quite in key, and he was now feeling more ill at ease and more hostile to his adopted environment. He had been carrying on an affair with a married woman, whom he had expected to divorce her husband and marry him. But he had become rather peevish with waiting, and she had decided that it was too much trouble, and that it was perhaps not really true that his drinking was due entirely to his failure to marry him. Lately, Clarence had taken to brooding on Stryker, whom he had been finding it rather difficult to see, and he had come to the conclusion that the latter was devious as well as sordid, and that he had been misrepresenting to Clarence the amount of profit he made. One Sunday afternoon, at last, when Clarence had been sitting alone with a succession of tall gin fizzes, he jumped up suddenly, strode out the door, cut straight through his grounds to the fence which divided his property from Stryker's, climbed over it with inspired agility, made a beeline for Stryker's house, purposely failing to follow the drive and stepping through the flower beds. Stryker came himself to the door with a look that, if Clarence had been sober, he would have realized was apprehensive. But when he saw the visitor was, he greeted him with a special cordiality and ushered him into his study. With his highly developed awareness, he had known at once what was coming. This study, which Clarence had never seen, as he went rarely to Stryker's house, was a disorderly and darkish place. It was characteristic of Stryker that his desk should seem littered and neglected, as if he were not really in touch with his affairs. And there was dust on the books in his bookcase, drably bound and unappetizing volumes on zoological and chemical subjects. Though it was daytime, the yellow-brown shades were pulled 3/4 down. On the desk on top of the bookcase stood a number of handsome stuffed ducks that Stryker had wished to preserve. Stryker sat down at the desk and offered Clarence a cigarette. Instead of protesting at once that Clarence's demands were impossible, as he had done on previous occasions, he listened with amiable patience. I'm going to go into the whole problem and put things on a different basis as soon as business slackens up in the spring. So I'd rather you'd wait till then, if you don't mind. We had a hard time filling the orders even before this strike began, and now I can hardly get the work done at all. They beat up 2 of my men yesterday, and they're threatening to make a raid on the factory. I've had to have the whole place guarded. The breeding ponds in the factory, which were situated half a mile away, have been closed by wire fence. Clarence had forgotten the strike, and he realized that he had perhaps come at a rather inopportune moment. I can't attend to a reorganization, Stryker went on to explain, which is what we've got to have at this point, till our labor troubles are settled and things have slowed up a bit. There ought to be more in this business for both of us, he concluded with a businessman's smile. And I won't forget your cooperative attitude when we make a new arrangement in the spring. The tension was thus relaxed, and Stryker went on to address Clarence with something like friendly concern. Why don't you have yourself a vacation, he suggested. I noticed you were looking run down. Why don't you go south for the winter? Go to Florida or someplace like that. It must be tough for a southerner like you to spend this nasty part of the year in the north. I'll advance you the money if you need it. Clarence was half tempted, and he began to talk to Stryker rather freely about the idiocies of the advertising agency and about the 2 aunts and a sister whom he had to support in Bouton Rouge. But in the course of the conversation, as his eyes escaped from Stryker's gaze, which he felt as uncomfortably intent in the gaps between sympathetic smiles, it lay on some old chemical apparatus, a row of glass test tubes and jars, which had presumably been carried along from Stryker's early career as a teacher. And he remembered, though the steps of his reasoning may have been guided, as he afterwards sometimes thought, by a delusion of persecution that had been growing on him in recent months, remembered the deaths, at intervals, of Stryker's well-to-do relatives. His eyes moved on to mounted ducks, with a rich but rather lusterless color. He had always been half-conscious with the other of his own superior grace of appearance and manner and speech, and had sometimes felt that Stryker admired it. And now as he contemplated Stryker, at ease in his turbid room, upended, as it were, behind his desk, with a broad expanse of plastron and a rubbery craning neck, regarding him with a small bright eye, set back in the brownish skin beyond a prominent snout-like formation of which the nostrils were sharply in evidence, as Clarence confronted Stryker, he felt first a fantastic suspicion, then a suddenly unnerving conviction. And hurriedly he got up and brushed away Stryker's regret that, since it was Sunday and the cook's day out, he was unable to ask him to dinner. But this nonchalance now disguised panic. It was hideously clear to him why Stryker had suggested his taking a trip. He wouldn't take it, of course, but what then? Stryker would surely try to get him in some other way. In his emotion, he forgot his hat and did not discover it till they had reached the porch. He stepped back into the study alone, and on an impulse took down from its rack on the wall the rifle with which Stryker, in the earlier days, had gone gunning for snapping turtles. He went to the open front door and shot Stryker. The cook was out. Only the gates were guarded, and Clarence had arrived at Stryker's by taking the back cut through the grounds. Nobody heard the shot. The suspicion all fell on the foreman, who had his own long-standing grudges against Stryker and had organized the current strike. He had already had to go into hiding to escape from his boss's thugs, and after the murder, he disappeared. Clarence Latouche decided that he would sell his Highgate County place and travel for a year in Europe, which he had always wanted to see. But just after he had bought his passage, the war with Hitler started and prevented him from getting off. An ironic misadventure, as he said, for a smart advertising man who had believed in exploitation of snapping turtles. He had disassociated himself from the soup business, and he went to live in Southern California, where, on his very much dwindled income, he is said to be drinking himself to death. He lives under the constant apprehension that the foreman may be found by the police, and that he will have to confess his own guilt in order to save an innocent man. Because Clarence is the soul of honor, so that Stryker may get him yet.